Next up, we have Richard Rothstein, author of the best-selling book, The Color of Law. You guys, I can't say enough. If you have not had an opportunity to check this book out, you absolutely must do that given today's social climate. It is a thought-provoking read on how entire US cities were developed to promote racial divide. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you. Let me begin by saying that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement. That civil rights movement succeeded in desegregating lunch counters and buses, public accommodations, interstate transportation, schools and colleges. And yet it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. Everyone that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. Well, how could that be? The civil rights movement persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, harmful to both blacks and whites, immoral, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? I think partly it's because it's harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate lunch counters. If we desegregate lunch counters, the next day you can sit at any lunch counter and go to any restaurant that you want. But if we pass a law desegregating neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites, have adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not doing anything about the fact that we live in an apartheid society by residents. And that excuse, the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of schools and colleges and public accommodations and interstate transportation, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation. And under the Constitution, if you have a civil rights violation like that, you're obligated to remedy it. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. And again, a civil rights violation that we understood we had an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. Residential segregation was created by private action, not by government, by bigoted homeowners or landlords who wouldn't rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or businesses in the private economy, real estate agents indeed, and banks that discriminated in how during the 20th century they rented or sold homes to African Americans. Or maybe it's because both blacks and whites just like to live with each other, the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. We prefer to live with each other like ourselves in skin color. Or maybe it's just because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites. Many of them can't afford to live in middle-class communities, and that's what created residential segregation. All of these individual, personal, perhaps bigoted decisions that created the segregation we know today. Not a constitutional violation because it wasn't done by government. And while we think the segregation that we have is too bad, there's nothing we feel obligated to do anything about it because these are not civil rights violations, just happen naturally. And what happened naturally, we tell ourselves, can only unhappen naturally. Well, I used to be an education columnist. I began this research into housing segregation because I was concerned about segregated schools. Schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 50 years. And they're more segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Those neighborhoods, we think, were segregated by accident, as I said before, de facto. And so there's not much we can do about it. But I began to wonder if that was really the case. And I read a Supreme Court decision in 2007 in which the Supreme Court prohibited school districts from taking explicit steps to desegregate because it said they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated, the neighborhoods they were located in were segregated de facto, and therefore were prohibited from doing anything to explicitly fix school segregation. And the court decision that I read involved Louisville, Kentucky. And I remembered reading before something that happened in Louisville, something involving a white homeowner in a single family home in Louisville who had a friend, an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran who was living in the center city of Louisville. The decorated Navy veteran, African-American, wife and child, wanted to move to a single family home. Nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single family, all white suburb of Louisville called Shively bought a second home in that community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows, so the police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors are all engaged in the conspiracy to maintain the residential boundaries, racial residential boundaries of Louisville, I looked into it further and I found out that this was not an unusual occurrence. There were hundreds and hundreds of examples in this country in the mid-20th century of police-directed, police-protected, sometimes even police-organized mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these police actions, police-protected mob actions, was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The police are agents of the state government. And we've never felt an obligation to remedy these civil rights violations. And then I began to look into it a bit further. And I discovered there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that created the residential segregation that we know today. Let me describe in the few minutes I have with you today a few of these federal, state, and local policies. Perhaps the most important one is a policy of the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, designed to move all white working class families out of downtown urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. This policy was implemented everywhere in the country. We created the suburbanization that we know today with this policy. Prior to the World War II period, there were no middle class, working class families living in suburbs to speak of. Suburbs were only for the affluent. Working and middle class families were located in sometimes integrated neighborhoods downtown, near deep water ports and railroad terminals, because we were a manufacturing economy. And at that time, all industry had to be located either near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. But the federal government resolved to move all white families out of these areas. They began to have automobiles where they could drive to work, move white families out of these areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. And these suburbs exist not only in Houston, but throughout Texas and in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and San Francisco, everywhere these suburbs existed. The most famous of them may be Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. But you go to the West Coast, they're just as prevalent. Westlake, south of San Francisco, 15,000 homes. Lakewood, south of Los Angeles, just about the same size. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration created all these suburbs on a whites-only basis. The developers of Levitt in east of New York City and Levittown, or Henry Dolger, who built the suburbs south of San Francisco. None of these developers could have assembled the capital on their own to buy the land, construct the houses for which they had no buyers. No bank would be crazy enough to lend them the money to do this because we weren't a suburban country at that time. The banks thought that no white families, working class families, would want to move to these places, even though the federal government was trying to get them to do it. The only way that developers of Levittown or Westlake or any of these others could get the capital to build these subdivisions was to go to the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations, proposing the plans for their development, the construction materials they were going to use, the design of the homes, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats requiring this commitment. It was written in the policy manual that was published by the Federal Housing Administration and used by the VA as well, distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate applications of developers to build suburban developments. The manual said explicitly that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a subdivision that was going to be inclusive of both African Americans and whites. You couldn't even, according to the manual, recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to be for whites only. If that development was going to be near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photo of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer outside Detroit had to construct to separate his development from a nearby Black neighborhood in order to get financing from a bank with a federal bank guarantee to build his subdivision. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Of course there was private bigotry. Many private actors, realtors, banks, private landlords willingly cooperated with this federal policy. But the private actors could not have created the segregation we know without government support and requirement. If, for example, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration had told builders like Levitt or Dolger or any of the others that, yes, we'll guarantee your bank loans to build these subdivisions, provided you sell the homes on a non-discriminatory basis, the builders would have had to do that irrespective of their private bigotry. So it's a mistake to think that private bigotry is what created the segregation. It was created by the federal government with cooperation from state and local governments as well. Let me mention one other policy that the federal government created, and that is public housing, something which many of us misunderstand as a place where poor people live, a place where there are lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, engaging in confrontations with the police. That's not how public housing began in this country. The first public housing for civilians in this country was created in the New Deal during the Depression. It was not for poor people. 25% of the country was unemployed, but 75% of the workforce had jobs. And that's who public housing was for. Public housing was designed both to create construction jobs and to provide a housing option for families in the Depression who could afford to rent housing, but for whom no housing was available because no construction activity was going on. Everywhere the federal government built this first civilian housing in this country, and this policy continued for the next 20 years, beginning in 1933, everywhere it built it, it created segregation with these projects frequently, creating separate Black and white projects in communities that had previously been integrated for the reasons I described before. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes talks about how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend was Polish in high school. He said he dated a Jewish girl there. That's what you would expect to happen in an integrated neighborhood, in an integrated high school. The Public Works Administration went into this downtown neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation with that and other projects in the Cleveland area that persists to this day. The very first civilian public housing project in this country was built in Atlanta. Atlanta had segregated water fountains and segregated buses and segregated lunch counters and segregated schools, but it had integrated housing for the reasons I described. Black and white workers had to live near their jobs in downtown areas. Public Works Administration went into this neighborhood outside Atlanta called the Flats, and outside downtown Atlanta called the Flats, and demolished housing there and built a project for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were living in this integrated area to double up, triple up with other relatives, find less adequate housing elsewhere. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to describe self-satisfied, smug places. They think they're better than you are. One of them, Cambridge, Massachusetts. You may have heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half Black and half white. Public Works Administration built 2 separate projects there, one for Blacks only, one for whites only. And with that and those and other housing projects elsewhere in the Boston area created the housing segregation that we know there today. There were many, many other policies that federal, state, and local governments created to enforce, create, and sustain racial segregation. The effects of these policies were so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape of today. This is not a historical curiosity. It actually determines our local conditions today. One way is by creating an enormous wealth gap between African Americans and whites that continues to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to find down payments for homes outside low-income segregated neighborhoods. The homes in these suburbs that I described before, Levittown or Westlake, sold at the time in the mid-20th century for about $8,000, $9,000, roughly $100,000 in today's money. Those homes, not in Houston, not in San Francisco, not in New York, no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some parts of the country, actually over $1 million, these $100,000 homes. Today, African Americans who could have afforded them when they were returning war veterans with jobs in the post-war economy or other jobs, could have afforded a $100,000 home, a mortgage on a $100,000 home, especially for returning war veterans who the VA said required no down payment. Today, these homes are unaffordable, and the white character of these neighborhoods is maintained. The white families who bought these homes in the mid-20th century gained wealth, gained equity from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that equity, that wealth, to send their children to college. They used it to finance medical emergencies, perhaps, or maybe temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren that now had down payments for their own homes as a result of this policy. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal racial policy from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that today, African American incomes on average in this country are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is today only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that our government acting on our behalf, implemented, and that we, all of us as American citizens, have an obligation to remedy. Well, the policies to remedy this segregation that we've created are well known, no mystery about them. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to take the kind of action that the civil rights movement 70 years ago took to desegregate the public facilities that I mentioned earlier. It's not going to happen without a change in political climate that only a new civil rights movement, an aggressive one, can create. I am very gratified to learn that the Houston Association of Realtors has taken efforts to create diversity in its own ranks, to make its own practices non-discriminatory, to eliminate whatever racism exists. But we need to go much farther than showing homes in a non-discriminatory way to all families, much farther than diversifying the ranks of the real estate industry, which is very important. I'm very happy to hear that you're doing that. But we actually need to take aggressive steps to change the composition of neighborhoods so that they are no longer segregated and denying of opportunity as they are today. The wealth gap that we created is responsible for the achievement gap in schools, which we spend so much time talking about because we concentrate the most disadvantaged young people in schools where their social and economic problems overwhelm the ability of schools to address them. The wealth gap and the segregation which it created is responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods, less access to fresh food, to transportation for good jobs. The segregation that we have created is responsible for the police abuse that we spent so much time talking about and demonstrating even about in the last few months. That abuse would not be nearly as severe. I'm not suggesting that there would be no discrimination at all, but would not nearly be so severe if we didn't have the kind of segregation that we have today, where, as I said, we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single communities where they have no access to good jobs or even the transportation to get to good jobs, or schools that have high achieving students. Police in those neighborhoods are an occupying force, as police in low-income segregated communities throughout the world have been occupying forces, whether in colonial India or colonial Congo. Police in this country operate in no different a way when they are faced with controlling low-income populations without opportunity. And the segregation we created has a much, much more dangerous and frightening effect. And that is the very, very, as I say, dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability, we have no ability to understand each other's life experiences, to empathize with each other, to develop, as I say, a common national identity. So that's the result of the civil rights violations that we created, and that, as I say, we have an obligation to remedy. There are many, many policies that the federal government could implement to remedy this, but there are things that real estate agents can do as well to begin to take small steps to remedy them. One of the ones that I've researched a lot is we know that test scores are not an accurate measure of the quality of schools. Math and reading test scores do not reflect good schools. They don't reflect whether a school has a diverse student body or a diverse faculty that trains students to adapt to a multicultural and diverse society as adults. They don't reflect whether a school is teaching good citizenship or providing art and music instruction and cooperative learning, that people learn to work with each other. And yet, real estate community, typically using websites like Zillow or Great Schools, identify the quality of a neighborhood by the quality of their schools measured by test scores, a misleading measure. And the result of this is we reinforce segregation, because what test scores really do reflect is the socioeconomic composition of the parents. When we direct children, or parents rather, to buy homes in schools with high test scores, we are creating an additional incentive for them to segregate themselves in more segregated white neighborhoods where the test scores are higher simply because the parents have greater levels of education themselves. There are many audit studies that is sending testers of both black and white with identical resumes, out to search for housing, which demonstrate that there still is discrimination that exists in the real estate industry. But frequently, those audit studies don't identify the perpetrators. Most real estate agents don't engage in steering, but some do, and we have very little ability to identify those who do discriminate and to get rid of them from this profession. We need audit studies that identify perpetrators, not simply that demonstrate over and over again that a percentage of realtors engage in that kind of activity. The real estate industry has an obligation to remedy its own actions in cooperation with the government in the 20th century to enable African Americans to come up with down payment assistance that enables them to buy homes in communities that they could afford the monthly payments on, but cannot afford the down payments for. We should be setting up voluntary funds contributed not only by the real estate industry, but by banks, by developers who contributed to this segregation that we have. And finally, we need to do much more, not only to diversify the real estate industry itself, but the National Association of Realtors should, I think, and as well as the Houston Association of Realtors, take an aggressive policy step to make sure that white realtors and black realtors are working together, even if they mostly serve different communities now, are working together to make sure that listings are shared and that families of different ethnicities and races have the opportunity to explore housing options in communities other than one of those they've already lived in and are familiar with. These are the some steps that can be taken in the real estate industry. The federal government obviously has the biggest role in redressing segregation. The federal government itself should be redressing its policies to create segregation by subsidizing the movement of African Americans out of neighborhoods in which they've been segregated and into more diverse, healthier neighborhoods with better transportation, better jobs, access to schools with high achievement, and supermarkets that sell healthy food. There are homes in these communities, as I said before, that from African Americans that were excluded, that sell for $100,000, that sold for $100,000 when African Americans were excluded from them. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The federal government should be buying up homes in these communities for $500,000, $400,000, whatever the market value is, and reselling some of them to African Americans for $100,000. This would be a very narrowly targeted remedy for a very explicit constitutional violation. At the low end, we have policies for lower income families that perpetuate and reinforce segregation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the low income housing tax credit to developers to build units for families that can't afford market rate housing. But those low income units under the low income housing tax credit typically reinforce segregation because they're placed in already low income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Obviously, developers prefer to place low-income units in already low-income neighborhoods. The land is cheaper there. They don't have to face a lot of community opposition. Potential renters can walk by the developments to see the places that are for sale, for rent rather. We should have positive policies that encourage the placement of units for low-income families in higher opportunity communities. So there are many, many policies that we could follow to redress the segregation that we, all of us, our government, created on our behalf, because it is our government, many policies to redress it. It won't happen without a new civil rights movement that makes it uncomfortable to maintain the segregated patterns for which we're responsible, that violate our Constitution, that are not de facto. I hope that out of the current attention that's being paid to the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, more accurate and passionate discussion we're now having in this country about those legacies than ever before in American history. I hope that out of those discussions, a new civil rights movement will emerge. I hope you'll be supportive of it and will familiarize yourselves with this history so that you will join me in understanding that all of us as American citizens have an obligation to remedy it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. Thank you.